Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight for another inner hour. I appreciate it. So, you may notice the background's a little different. Some of you who were here last week or the week before, we're having trouble with one of our desktop computers, and so the office where we usually do that has all the bookcases and whatnot behind us. Um, that's the computer that's not working well. It's a large iMac. So anyway, we're on a different one tonight in a little corner, a different corner of the house. So the computer works well, but not a great office looking background or any kind of look. It's mostly a closet door you get to see. But anyway, that's where we're at tonight. So we can at least do the program. And thanks for joining us. Going to take a moment. I usually light a candle to start these series with, just as a opportunity for me and you to have a moment to focus and uh, kind of let go of the day. So the typical candle is not in here. We did some last minute rushing around to get this switched up, but I do actually have a candle going. It's a column candle. So see, there's at least a flame. There's a candle going in here. It's already been lit because it's a hard one to light, but it's going. So yay. Uh, Grateful for that. So tonight, we're starting on a brand new series that I called the Essenes and Beyond, because I didn't have a really good title in mind. I got a couple of, I've requested before suggestions and ideas about things that you would like me to cover. And believe it or not, I got two suggestions, not at the same time, about doing something on the Essenes, which several people know something about, some people know nothing about, and some people know quite a bit about. Um, there, so I want to share with you in this series about the Essenes, but also some other groups that were almost nobody ever hears about anymore. They've kind of faded. Unless you're a historical researcher or a scholar, you probably haven't heard of them. But they were critical in the development of the early Jesus movement, and and basically it's the group that lost they their particular beliefs and position ended up not being the one that was remembered by history, and the things that Paul taught became the foundation of what later was the Christian church. And while we're not doing that particular series or topic tonight, what Paul taught and what evolved into present day Christianity over many hundreds of years based on what Paul taught is really quite different than what Jesus taught. Um, in this series, I'm mostly going to refer to Jesus as Yeshua because that was his Hebrew name. Um, it basically means salvation. In fact, if you want to say just the word salvation in Hebrew, it's the same word. It's a shorter version of Yehoshua, which means Yah or God saves or is salvation. But that was his actual personal name. It was a common name, not an uncommon name, in the first century Israel. So anyway, so tonight is going to be kind of historical background, and hopefully there'll be a few things you can apply out of this too, because I like to do things that I think are practical. I'm going to confess that tonight, the first class in the series is going to be largely historical, but I hope interesting. And and then at any point tonight or in this series, you're welcome to turn on your cameras and mics and make a comment or ask a question. There's not going to be a separate question and answer period. You're just welcome to do that at any point. Make it about the topic, if you would, please. Not something in general, but any questions about what we're doing tonight, or any comments on it, you're welcome to make during the program as you like. So, um, so first of all, the time period in which Yeshua lived is we now call the Second Temple period. It was a rather long period of time, but the Second Temple, because the first temple built by David and then Solomon um, were was destroyed, and um, and then many years there was no temple, and then finally a Persian king, Cyrus, allowed the Jews back into Jerusalem and allowed them to rebuild their temple, and that was the Second Temple, which then King Herod, during the era of Jesus, built much bigger, expanded tremendously made it a really remarkable, beautiful place. So anyway, um, it was in that Second Temple period. And we also have the designation of BC and AD, meaning before Christ, and Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. The scholars tend not to do that. They use BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, Common Era. So those are the same terms, meaning the same things, just it doesn't focus on Christ, so it's considered more scholarly and less Christian. Um, anyway, so there were a lot of groups. E- Even today, people tend to lump groups together. They think, well, they're Christian, so they believe this, or they're Jewish, so they believe that, or they're with, you know, whoever, they're with Unity, so they believe this. And the truth is, then and now, um, people have widely diverse beliefs with even in the same spiritual communities. And there were a number of different Jewish communities that believed quite different things from each other that were existing at the time of Jesus. And he interacts with almost all of them in the New Testament. We see almost all of them represented. Um, and we generally are taught nothing about them. And so some of the conflicts that Yeshua has in the New Testament that Christians now say, oh, see, he was having this conflict with the Jews. Oh, see, the Jews hated him. Oh, see, the Jews wanted him dead. All of that's false. Um, what is accurate is to say there were certain groups of Jews that didn't like him, certain groups of Jews that were threatened by him, certain groups of Jewish leadership that did want him dead. That's true. But it was not actually true of most Jews at the time. Yeshua was a Jew, born a Jew, raised a Jew, lived as a Jew his entire life. And during his lifetime, historically, at least as far as we know, he had 100% Jewish disciples. His movement never stepped outside of Judaism, ever in his lifetime. That was much, much later. So anyway, um, so some of the prominent groups, and how do we know these are prominent groups? Because fortunately, we have several historians from that period of time who wrote about things going on in Israel, including these various Jewish sects or factions. The three primary historians were Josephus, who himself was a Jew, and then later defected to Rome and became a historian for Rome, but he wrote a lot about Israel. And the second is Philo, who was also a Jew, and Pliny. So those are the three historians that mention these different groups and quite a lot of other things that were happening historically. So we have record of things that are in the New Testament. We have record of some of those things by historians who lived in the same time period outside the New Testament. So the groups. So the first group was called the Sadducees. And the Sadducees, the word basically means a descendant of Zadok. Zadok was a high priest during the reign of King David, was considered a great priest and extremely loyal to David and the house of David. Um, that's another story. But so the Sadducees were considered to be priests who were descended directly from the line of that priest, Zadok. The Sadducees had some interesting beliefs that we may not associate with Jesus or Judaism in general. Um, so the Sadducees were primarily priests. Not all priests were Sadducees, but many of them were. And they were also very wealthy. The Sadducee group was a very wealthy group of people. They were aristocratic families. They held a lot of political and social power as well as religious power. Many of them were wealthy tradesmen or merchants. It was not a poor or uneducated class of people. And they were held significant influence in a group called the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin comes into play because it was the Jewish court of law in our terms. Um, and they come into play in the whole Jesus time period of getting him. Were they going to try to persuade Rome to arrest him or were they not? Jesus had friends on the Sanhedrin and had enemies on the Sanhedrin both. He was a very divisive factor. People tend to love him or hate him. The Sanhedrin was composed of a number of different people, but the Sadducees were a very influential group within the Sanhedrin, this court, Jewish court. It's not identical, but it would be similar to thinking of our Supreme Court in the United States. We have a lot of lower courts, local courts, appellate courts, federal courts. Then we have the Supreme Court that's the final arbitrator of law in the United States and the interpretation of that law. The Sanhedrin, there are lots of smaller local ruling councils and judges, but the Sanhedrin was the ultimate authority for Israel, and it was the final word on things. So what did the Sadducees believe and what did they not believe? First of all, there was no Bible at all during the time of Jesus. Not only was there no New Testament, obviously, there was also no Jewish Bible or Hebrew Bible. There were the 5 books of Moses, which were actually scrolls back then. Um, those are the first 5 books in your Bible today. And those were all believed at the time to have been written by Moses himself. Then there was something that they called the prophets, and that was a miscellaneous collection of writings, not a book, by things like the prophet Isaiah, prophet Zechariah, Jeremiah, Micah, a number of things. They were all lumped together, and there were various writings from these various so-called prophets. So there was the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and the prophets. Then a little bit later, there was also something they incorporated called the writings, and that was not written by prophets and not written by Moses. So that was a third group of things. And the writings include things like Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and some non-prophetic, non-Moses books. All of those eventually got organized and lumped together and became what's called the Hebrew Bible, which is very, very similar, although laid out slightly differently than the Christian Old Testament. So the Sadducee group believed in the 5 books of Moses. That was it. There was no other sacred scripture. They did not accept the writings of the prophets as divinely inspired or as the teachings of God. They did not accept the writings of David or Solomon or others in the group called the writings. They accepted only the first 5 books of Moses. Because they accepted only the first 5 books of Moses, the Sadducees did not believe in any life after death. I don't know if you've ever realized this, but none of the first 5 books in the Bible, the 5 books of Moses, the so-called official Torah, doesn't mention afterlife anywhere. So the Sadducees rejected the idea of an afterlife. They rejected the idea of resurrection. They rejected the idea of angels and demons. They rejected the idea of anything supernatural. They rejected the idea of soul, let alone the immortality of soul. So things that we think of as pretty standard religious stuff, they rejected all of that. The Torah was a way to live, an ethical, moral standard of how to live that pleased God, and that's what we were supposed to do. But all the other stuff, they did not believe in. So that put them at odds with almost every other Jewish group. Well, really, I think every other Jewish group at the time, as far as beliefs go. They were very limited, and they were also very, very strict. What the Torah said literally, that's it. That's what it meant. It meant this literally. It didn't mean anything else. There was no symbolism in it. There was no interpretation in it. There was no adding to it or detracting from it. There was no oral law. No, none of that. So that group as a whole viewed Yeshua, as he got very popular, as a big, big threat to their power and authority, because what he was teaching threatened the need for a priesthood and challenged their authority on spiritual matters. So they felt him very dangerous to their position, their wealth, and their power. So they were, almost all of them, definitely opponents. They were very cooperative and friendly with the Romans, who were the foreign military conquerors of Israel at the time. And the Romans were very friendly and supportive of the Sadducees. Another reason many other Jewish groups did not like the Sadducees. The Romans went so far as to remove the actual legitimate priesthood in the temple at the time and put in people from the Sadducee party that the Romans liked, who were close collaborators with theirs, and put them in as high priests. So the high priest in the temple by Yeshua and others, was not considered legitimately the high priest of the temple. And many of the things that they were allowing to be done in the temple uh, also were considered impure by many other Jewish groups, including Yeshua. So they were at odds with most of the temple leadership in Yeshua's time. Um, so the Sanhedrin, rather, that I mentioned, the Jewish court, uh, its place of meeting, like the Supreme Court has its own place in Washington, D.C. The Sanhedrin's place of meeting was in the temple at Jerusalem. It was especially a room called the Chamber of Hewn Stones, and that's where they held court. That's where they met. One of the places Yeshua was dragged to in the middle of the night during his trial, which was illegal. They weren't allowed to meet at night. They weren't allowed to try capital crimes, which his was. There were a lot of illegal things that happened in the process of him getting arrested and convicted. And when they called the meeting for his Jewish trial, they only called the people in the Sanhedrin who were opposed to him, which was also illegal. So that's another story, though. But then the second group, so you have the group of Sadducees. So first of all, pausing there for a moment, somebody who takes scripture in a very, very rigid way, no interpretation allowed, no symbolism allowed. Everything it says is literal. It means that and only that, nothing else, never could mean anything else. That's it. And everybody who believes anything other than that is wrong and opposed to God. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Do you know anybody these days that feels that way? Because there are a lot of them. Um, so whether they're fundamentalist Christians or fundamentalist Muslims or fundamentalist anybody's that take scripture at only the literal level and everybody else is um, wrong and opposed to what God is trying to do. That was the Sadducee view. That view is still present in our culture today, not just among Jews. Second group is called the Pharisees. Um, the probable Jewish root of that word means separated, and they were separated from other Jewish groups because they did accept the five books of Moses. They also accepted the writings of the prophets, and they also accepted the wisdom writings. They considered all of that to be the word of God and inspired by God. They also believed that it needed to be interpreted and applied um, according to the current in our current lives, that we needed to continually reinterpret, re-understand what it was teaching and find ways to apply that in our lives. That was a big teaching of the Pharisee group. And um, that was the most prominent sect of Jewish belief during the time of Jesus was the Pharisees. And many of the things he taught, contrary to Christian churches, some of which over the years have taught the Pharisees were his opponents, not true. Again, there were some individuals, but overall, what Yeshua taught was in agreement with quite a bit of what the Pharisees taught about the accepting the entire set of works, the Torah, prophets, and writings as sacred. Yeshua did do that. He quoted from all of them. He um, counseled people to adhere to all of those teachings. Um, the Pharisees had another unique thing that becomes important a little bit later. They believed that in addition to the written law that got into what became the Hebrew Bible, that at Mount Sinai, Moses received an oral tradition, a non-written transmission from God directly, a set of oral teachings that was not to be written down and was passed from teacher to student, from person to person, and was kept alive in that fashion. That oral Torah, that oral law, becomes important later on. And almost all of the Kabbalistic works, if you've heard of Kabbalah, which is a centuries-long collection of Jewish mystical writings by many, many different rabbis and teachers. The Kabbalah basically means it's received, and what that originally referred to was this is the received oral law. These are the secret oral teachings that Moses received, and then rabbis elaborating on those and their understanding of them over the ages. Uh, the Pharisees did believe in life after death. They did believe in the immortality of the soul. They did believe in resurrection of the dead. So as it all right off the bat, you see a lot of consistency with what Yeshua taught. Um, they believed that there would come a time of reckoning when the righteous and the good, as well as the bad and the wicked and evil, when they would all receive their rewards based on their deeds, that God would have a judgment or a reckoning somehow, where the evil guys would get theirs and the good guys would get, good stuff. Yeshua did teach that, and the Pharisees taught that as well. Um, One of the prominent Pharisees who was also on the Sanhedrin was a man named Nicodemus, who was extreme, if not an outright follower of Yeshua, certainly very, very intrigued by him and wanted to study with him and learn more about what he was teaching, and helped out the movement in ways when he could. The Pharisees also were messianic. They believed that the Jews were living in the last times and that a Messiah would be sent to usher in a new age in Israel. The Jews, the Pharisees, and all other Jews for that matter, historically, that we have record of, never confused the Messiah with God. Not ever. You don't see any Jewish writings saying the Messiah is God or Son of God. That was not the case. The Messiah in Jewish tradition, as opposed to Christian, was always a human being, born as a human being, naturally between a man and a woman, uh, a human being who was chosen and anointed. The word Messiah comes from Mashiach in Hebrew, which means anointed. And kings and prophets were anointed in ancient Israel. So this Messiah would have been a prophet, and they believed him being of the line of David to also be a king. So the rightful king of Israel. So the Pharisees believed that there was a Messiah coming. The Sadducees did not. Um, the Pharisees also did another really important thing. It doesn't matter too much in the Jesus time directly, but right after that it did. Um, if you take all of the teachings of the Hebrew Bible and all of the so-called commandments in there, of which there are some 613, well over 90% of those commandments involve the temple, actions that had to be done at the temple, sacrifices at the temple, offerings at the temple, festivals at the temple, holy days at the temple. It was very temple-based faith. And shortly after, in the generation of Jesus, but after he had been killed, the Jews rebelled against Rome, and in 70 AD, that rebellion was totally crushed, and Rome obliterated and tore down and burnt to the ground the temple in Jerusalem, the second temple. After that, there was no other temple, and there still has not been another temple. Um, so all of the faith that was centered around the temple now couldn't be done because there was no temple. So the Pharisees, so Judaism basically died with the temple. Um, However, the Pharisees, believing in interpreting the teachings and finding ways to continually reapply them in our lives, the Pharisees made a huge transformation and became what is now considered rabbinic Judaism, which is what allowed Judaism to survive. And they said things like, okay, we can't do sacrifices anymore in the temple. So you know what sacrifices are now? Sacrifices are prayers. Our prayers and our prayer and meditation time. That's our sacrifice to God. Not the slaughter of animals in a temple, but prayers. That's how we sacrifice to God. Do you know where the temple is now? It's not that building anymore that doesn't exist. The temple now is your home. Your home is the temple. That's where you do your worship. So they reoriented everything to the home, to the individual practice, and to prayer and meditation and study. And so um, that's really transformed Judaism and allowed it to continue to be a vital religion that flourished. So now we're getting around to the, I'm not sure why this thing keeps stinging or how to make it stop doing that. Um, but anyway, so sorry about that part. I assume you can hear because it's really loud in here. But the the third group, which was a very, very, very small group, was called the Essenes. And that is not something they refer to themselves as. If you read any of their documents, they never ever use that name and they don't call themselves that. This was the name that outsiders called them. And um, they started before the time of Jesus. The earliest Essene settlements and writings were about 2 centuries before Jesus was born. So roughly what we would call 2 BC, 200 BC, rather, 200 BC. And and they flourished until about the end of the Jesus era, about the end of the first century AD. After that, you don't see them anymore. Their settlements are all gone. No more writings. They're just gone. Um, so the Essenes, in terms of what they believed in the teachings of Moses and the prophets and the writings. So they're the same as the Pharisees so far. They were an apocalyptic group. They not only believed one day a Messiah would be coming, they believed that it would be coming in their lifetime. This was the end of the age. They were going to see the end of the world. God was going to usher in a new kingdom through 2 messiahs. They believed in 2 messiahs, not one. They believed in a Messiah who was called the son of Joseph and a Messiah called the son of David. They had different roles and would do different things. We'll talk about that further on in the series. So they were a messianic group. They believed all that was happening in their lifetime. Um, there were Essenes spread among all Jewish villages and communities. Even though it was a small following, they were spread out. But they had two rather large centers, community centers. One was on Mount Tabor, and one was in a settlement called Qumran, which we now call Qumran. It was on the northwest edge of the Dead Sea. That that whole area is what was called the wilderness back then. So if you've heard about John the Baptist living and teaching in the wilderness and baptizing in the River Jordan runs right through there and then ends at the Dead Sea. On the top side of the Dead Sea, that's where it empties into the Dead Sea on the northwest side. That was the wilderness area. It's a very desert area, tons and tons of caves. That's where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947. We're in caves in that region. Um, a lot of what were called wadis, which are these deep ravines with caves everywhere, very dry, very deserty, which is why a lot of the parchments were preserved in pottery and things like that. Um, they very much observed the laws of Moses. Sabbath was very important to them, Sabbath observance. Ritual purity was even more important to them than the law of Moses required. They were extremely, almost fanatical about bodily cleanliness and ritual purity both. They really believed a new age was coming. They rejected the temple in Jerusalem altogether. They said the temple is now totally corrupt. It was run by people Romans had put in, which was true. They were allowing animal sacrifice and money changing in the temple, which the Essenes were very opposed to. Who does that sound like? If you know the story of Yeshua going in and throwing all those people out of the temple. Um, they were they had a strong emphasis on prophecy and the prophets. Um, it is, in many scholars' opinions, very likely that John the Baptist was a member of that group. I'll come back to John in a moment. Um, they were an influential sect philosophically and theologically, for sure, even though they were statistically a rather small group. Um, and a couple of other things real quickly about the temple. The most of the Essenes, if not all, most of them practice vegetarianism. And apparently John the Baptist did too. As I said, I'll get to him in a moment. And Jesus may have. I know it says he drank wine and ate fish and all that stuff, but we'll get to that either in a moment or later, maybe next time. But the Essene group was almost exclusively vegetarian because the Essene group had something that they have a lot in their writings, and it says from the beginning, it was so. or from the beginning it was not so when they're describing certain things. That's a phrase that Jesus uses in the New Testament fairly often. When people ask him about divorce, he doesn't just say, well, my opinion is, and he also doesn't just say, well, Moses said it's okay under these circumstances. What he says was, it was not so from the beginning. So that's an Essene phrase, something Yeshua uses commonly. Another common Essene phrase that no other group that we know of, there are no other writings from any of these other groups that use this phrase. Um, the Essenes used a phrase called the children or sons of light and the children or sons of darkness. Jesus uses that also quite a bit in the New Testament. The Pharisees never used that in any of their writings, neither did the Sadducees, neither did any of the other Jewish groups contemporary with him. That was an Essene thing. So again, huge similarity between a very unique phrase that Jesus used repeatedly and the Essenes used repeatedly. Um, the the vegetarianism part was because in the beginning, in the Torah, in the book of Genesis, after the creation has been formed and mankind has been formed and placed in the garden, whether you believe this or not personally, or whether any of us do now, the story is that nothing ate anything else. Mankind was given fruits, vegetables, herbs um, to eat. It was a vegetarian diet. It specifically says that that's what they're to eat. It also says that that's what animals ate. So animals did not eat each other either. There were no predatory animals in the original story. Everything, nothing that God created ate something else that God created. Living creatures I'm talking about. Did not happen. They were all vegetarian. Mankind and animals in the wild were vegetarian. Then after the flood, this is when things changed. After the flood, when the flood waters finally receded and Noah and his family came out and that whole story, then there was nothing to eat because in that region, all of the vegetation had basically been destroyed by the flood. So there wasn't anything to eat, or certainly not enough to eat. So it was at that point that God allowed the taking of animal life for food. And the Essene group believed that was a temporary, something that was allowed temporarily until they could get the crops and vegetation and trees and whatnot back again, but that was never intended to be the way it was. From the beginning, it was not so. So they were vegetarian. And they also, the Essenes believed, that all of the animal sacrifices in the temple were impure and not ever something God asked to be done. They believed that that was an impure practice that the priesthood had started in the temple, not God, having been influenced by all of the other groups around Jews. Jews, their entire existence almost, but particularly in this time and a couple hundred years before, everybody that surrounded them, the so-called pagans, those people all practiced live human sacrifice, almost all child sacrifice to the god Molech, to the goddess Astara, different gods and goddess beliefs, but that involved human bloodletting and sacrifice, usually children. That's where the idea of sacrificing the pure and without blemish and innocent young comes from. And so the Essenes believed that the priesthood, under pressure from the people, adopted that. They wouldn't let them do human sacrifice anymore, but because the people were so used to sacrifice, blood sacrifice, they said, okay, we'll do that too. And so they did animal sacrifice. But the Essenes said that was never something God instructed them to do and didn't believe in it and would not participate in the temple because of that, what they considered serious corruption. You see Yeshua evidencing a very similar passionate feeling in his action against those people in the temple and throwing all of them out, saying, you're never meant to be here. This is my Father's house. It's to be a house of prayer. So seems to be very similar teaching. Now, for those of us that grew up thinking that at Mount Sinai, Moses received all these commandments from God about sacrifice in the temple, because it says that in various places in Exodus and Deuteronomy and elsewhere. We have a problem with that because one of the primary prophets, Jeremiah, primarily in chapter 7, says specifically that that was not so. In Jeremiah chapter 7, God is speaking to the people through Jeremiah and says, when I spoke to your forefathers that day on Mount Sinai, I gave them no instructions whatsoever about animal sacrifice or rituals. I said, listen to my voice and I will be your God. That's it. So the prophet agrees with Yeshua and the Essenes, but almost nobody else in Judaism at that time did. They saw all the sacrifices as ordained by God and very holy. The Essenes absolutely did not. Um, so, uh, and John the Baptist, when he's described in the New Testament, is described as wearing a garment of camel hair and eating locusts and 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 so we have this image of him being this crazy person who's dressed in these really rough clothes and eating bugs. But and that's been the image, it's been portrayed of him for forever. But if you actually do any research about it, in first century linens, the most expensive and softest of garments available for inner tunics and garments were made of camel hair. It wasn't the rough burlappy type things we're thinking of. It was a very, very soft, silky, like very expensive, worn by kings and royalty and rich people, basically. That's what he had on. And the word that's used for locust is not the word that means bugs or grasshoppers. It's a word that comes from another Semite language, which means it's karub, and it means the fruit of a carob tree, what we would call a carob tree, which is a type of locust tree. And the fruit of that tree is still used today to make something we call carob, which is a often used for a chocolate substitute for people who can't have chocolate. Doesn't have the caffeine, doesn't have the sugars. It's okay for diabetics mostly. Um, so it's used in a lot of uh, as a chocolate substitute in many cases. And so more likely than him eating bugs was he was eating this very sweet carob pods that are like chocolate in the wilderness and clothed in something very fine. Even in the place in the New Testament where Jesus is talking about John the Baptist, he's not talking about his clothes at that point, but he says to people, who was it you were going out in the wilderness to see? A man dressed in fine, soft clothes, like you find in the house of kings? Because that's what John was wearing. So we have this very incorrect image of John that makes him look like a lunatic. Um, John the Baptist's parents, Anna and Zachariah, are written about um, and seem to have also been vegetarian and raised John as a vegetarian and seem to be, if not Essenes themselves, very sympathetic to the Essene movement. So there is a very likely connection between John the Baptist and Essenes and a very probable connection to vegetarianism there as well. The Essenes not only practiced vegetarianism, they taught everybody should practice it because that was the way God intended. So they were, um, it was part of their teaching. They didn't just have a teaching about God and various prayer practices. They also taught dietary things. They're also known as great healers, and they did a lot of what we would call probably naturopathic work. They used a lot of herbs and poultices and um, nutrition to do a lot of healing work back then. One of the names they were known by in Greek was therapeutai, which is where we get our word therapeutic, because they were so skilled in natural healings. Um, all right, so we'll get back to more of the Essenes later in the series, but just to finish off here, another prominent group was called the Zealots. Um, the Zealots were primarily a political movement, and they were like fanatics, like Torah fanatics. They were really, really, really into Torah. Um, they believed that there should be no kings, there should be no judges. There was God alone should be the sovereign of Israel and everybody in Israel. That the Romans should be kicked out of Israel by any means necessary. They actively fomented physical, violent rebellion against Rome, and because they were such a small group, and even the Jews at large were small compared to the Roman Empire and their armies. Um, they worked primarily by what we would think of maybe today as terrorist tactics or guerrilla tactics. They would do small attacks on supply lines or small targeted assassinations of Roman leaders. There was a particular branch of the Zealots called Sicarii. They didn't have firearms in those days, of course, so they used rather lethal daggers that were small. They weren't as big as swords, but they were bigger than like a pocket knife. They were fairly sizable, but easily concealed. So they would plan times and actually commit their assassinations with these daggers or Sicarii. So they were called the Sicarii. Um, and to stop there for a moment, they were had no problem with using violence at all. They did very much use violence. They played a significant role in the first Jewish rebellion, as I mentioned, after Jesus was killed, when the Jews finally rebelled in 66 AD. They went on to 70. Well, the temple was destroyed in 70, but the rebellion went on even a little longer. Um, the Zealots were a primary motivating factor in that group. So in the Jesus movement, um, as he chooses 12 people that he calls apostles, meaning those who are going to be sent out. That was a Greek word, but meaning those he's going to send out with his authority to teach and heal. There were 12 men. And among those 12 men, one of them was a zealot. In the New Testament, he's called Simon the Zealot. So we have one of those violent zealot members in the inner circle of Yeshua's 12. Now, whether he was still active as a zealot or whether Yeshua had transformed him and he was no longer a violent person and was not supporting that position, there's really nothing written about that. So we just don't know. But that he was a member of the 12 is beyond question in the texts. So that was another small but very powerful group, and one of the few that openly advocated violence to free Israel. So I'm going to just stop there for a moment. In the rest of the series, we're going to get more specifically into the Essenes and two other groups that we're not going to have time to touch on tonight that were did not pre-exist Jesus. They came along after Jesus, after Yeshua, a group called the Ebionites and a group called the Nazarites. And so we'll talk more about those in the next couple of weeks. Those were really critical in the early development of what we think of as the Jesus movement. This is way, way, way before Paul came along and way before the Christianization of Jesus happened in Paul and then the Catholic Church and so on. And the Emperor Constantine's era, 325 AD, huge, 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 huge changes in what was believed about Jesus that had been in the works for a couple hundred years, but dramatic changes back in that era. So to just pause for a moment. So you have a group of people, the Sadducees, who think that only this much of the Bible is true and it's all literal. And only if you look at it that way are you doing what God wants. And if not, you're not. So do you know people today that have that attitude about the Bible? Or perhaps a different holy work if they're from a different tradition? Well, because I certainly do. Then you have people that believe that it's kind of a guideline, that the moral principles are there, that there are some universally true things there, but then you have to learn how to interpret it and apply it in your own life, as opposed to, and that it has many levels of symbolic meaning and spiritual meaning, not just literal meaning. So, know anybody like that in the world today? And then you have people that are separatists. They're very purist, like the Essenes. They believe that you should basically withdraw from the world, withdraw from traditional religion, withdraw from organized religion, and just pray and meditate in seclusion somewhere. And that's how you're going to get to God. And that's the safest thing to do because the world is all corrupt. And the more you involve yourself in the world, the more contaminated you get. So anybody see that belief out there today? Um, and then you also have the zealots that believe if you see something wrong, you take action to correct it, including violent action, up to and including murder, to get what you think should be the right way. Um, and people who resist that, who become your enemy, you're entitled to use whatever violent forms you need to defeat them. So, have we changed that much in 2000 years? Do you see those positions still represented in the world? So I'm going to pause for a moment here in case anybody has comments or questions. Uh, I'm going to just be quiet and see if anybody would like to share something with us. So have you ever, so since no one is, have you ever been to an organization or been told by someone from an organization that the Bible is all literally true? Because if you have, those are today's Sadducees. Um, that's that's the only way they see it, and that's the right way to see it, and there is no other way to see it. Um, if you have people that are struggling to figure out what to believe and how to understand the teachings and how to apply them in their lives, if you know anybody like that, including yourself maybe, who believe that there are other levels of meaning to Scripture besides the literal, and that we need to figure out what those are and how, what does that mean to us in our life? How can we work with that? Then you're looking at a group of Pharisees. And if you have people that think the solution is to withdraw from the world because it's so impure and so violent and so uh, dangerous to your soul that you could get caught up in it, get cut off from God somehow, that you should basically withdraw into small isolated communities, small caves, or perhaps your own house, and just do your own prayer and meditation and study because everything else will has a danger of contaminating you. Um, if you know of anything like that, then that's the Essene group of today, so to speak. I'm not saying they're literally reincarnations of those people, although there's some possibility of that. But I am saying that that way of looking is still very present today, and certainly you don't have to go very far to see people who believe in using violence to get their way in the world today. So it's all still really present, and And it was a very confusing time back then with all these competing ideologies and all these different ways of looking at what was right and wrong, and all these different ways of people saying, well, this is the way you get to God. Well, no, that's not it. You have to do it like this. No, 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 it's not that. It's like this. Um, so it was a very violent time then too. And it was a very socially chaotic time of upheaval then too. And people were very confused as they are now. And you had some people that really just kind of gave up into despair because they didn't know what was true or who to believe because so much of that they believed, somebody else would say it's not like this at all. They're mistaken, they're lying to you, they're using you, they're whatever. And um, I think you can see, as I said before, we haven't progressed all that much farther in 2000 some years because that's all still happening. We live in a time that's of great upheaval, of a lot of chaos, of a lot of violence, of a lot of uncertainty, of conflicting ideologies, of people arguing over those ideologies to the point of fighting in the streets over them or beating people or even killing people over them. Uh, so I think that in studying some of these groups and how they interacted with each other, and in particular, how did Yeshua deal with them? How did he interact with these different groups? I think we might be able to navigate some understanding of um, what can we learn from that so that we can navigate this um, craziness that that we kind of seem to see around us. How can we find our way through all of that and really come to peace with God and ourselves and and find a way to live in greater harmony with each other? How can we do that? Because some of these groups were able to do that. And Yeshua was somebody that moved among all of those groups. He didn't isolate himself into any one of those. He didn't even align with it. He didn't even say, hey, join me. I'm going to hook up with the Pharisees, so be like us. He didn't even do that. He didn't even say, hey, blah, 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 only do this. Um, and you do see the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Zealots all repeatedly in the New Testament. What you don't see is the Essenes in the New Testament. You do not see them in the New Testament. Um, that's interesting because they were very influential. So here's a couple of things about that. One is that is not a name they used for themselves. Do you want to know the two names by which they referred to themselves in their own writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls that we found, which most everybody thinks were this community that I'm calling the Essenes? Uh, in their own writings, they refer to themselves as Yachad, which is a Hebrew word that means community, basically. So basically, they were saying this community, our community. The other way that they called themselves was Haderech, which means the way. These were followers of the way. They were teachers of the way. Do you know what Yeshua's followers were called in the New Testament? Way before they were called Christian, they were called the way, followers of the way. So we have again an unusual designation that's absolutely identical between what the Essenes themselves called themselves and what Yeshua and his own disciples called themselves. So there is an interesting connection there. There is another interesting connection um, in this section in Matthew 5 through 7, where Yeshua is right after the Beatitudes, when Yeshua is saying things like, you've heard it said, or it is written that you shall not commit murder, but I say you shall not hold anger in your heart. You've heard it said you shall not commit adultery, but I say you should not hold lust in your heart. That section. Um, Everything he quotes in that section is from the teachings of Moses. Primarily it's the Ten Commandments, but some others too. But they're all clearly teachings from Torah. And he's not saying these are wrong. He's saying these are right. And here's where it all starts. It all starts with what you hold and nurture in your heart. But one of those sayings says, you've heard it said that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, you shall love even those who persecute you and oppose you. Hang on one second, Eunice, thanks. That particular saying is not anywhere in Torah. Torah never says, love your neighbors and hate your enemies. But the Essene Manual of Discipline, which we now have, since we've discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, the first paragraph rather, in the Essene Manual of Discipline says, you are to love your neighbors and love your neighbors and hate your enemies. So Jesus is directly quoting the Essenes in that section of the New Testament. Yeah, go ahead, Eunice, or Ted.
Um, I seem to recall from my formal education, a group called the Nazarenes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Where do they fall in this? Because they seem to be connecting at that time Yeshua with the Nazarenes as well.
Yes,
So,
we're going to do that next week, actually. There's two groups, Nazarenes and Ebionites. Um,
oh, I haven't.
we'll do both of those next week, yes. And there's a lot of confusion about the Nazarenes, which we'll talk about next week, because of the fact that there's a town named Nazareth. And so
And those were the dates.
yes. And there's also a Nazarite vow that Jews could take. It was a year-long vow for purification purposes that had specific requirements to it. So there's quite a bit of confusion. So we'll get into that more when we have more time. But thank you for bringing that up, because we're going to touch on Nazarenes and Ebionites next week, both as we get further into all that. But thank you.
Well, and how could I miss an opportunity to confuse things?
Yeah, so that's excellent. That's really great, actually. So thank you. Um, and many people have not heard of that at all. They might have heard of Jesus the Nazarene, but they don't know about any of those groups. So some of the next week's information will probably be new to some of you, I think. Certainly not all of you, but anyway. So thank you for tonight. It will, while we'll still be doing some history things, we'll be doing less informational things next week. Still some informational things, but more things that hopefully will be practical as opposed to just kind of laying the foundation here this week. I hope you do see, though, that these representative ideologies, if you will, or philosophies or ways of looking at God and ways of looking at life, that they're still quite present among us. We still have those same primary viewpoints, the literalist viewpoint, the symbolic viewpoint, the withdrawal from the world viewpoint, and the let's use violence to get what we want viewpoint. Those are all still very, very present in our world right now. Um, and Yeshua um, navigated all those and didn't advocate just any single one of those. And some of those he didn't advocate at all. So Penny, go ahead. And welcome here, by the way. Hi there.
Thank you. Um, I don't have much to say right now, but I've been immersing myself in the Quakers.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So if you ever want to have me say anything about them and what their belief system is, and
Yeah,
it's very interesting.
it very much is. Yes, yes, thank you. That could definitely tie in because of their whole how they conduct their service, their outlook. Yeah, very, very much so. Yeah, so thank you for the offer. I will hold you to that.
Yeah. So the thing about the Bible to them, um, well, anyway, George Fox, who brought the Quakerism to the United States, he used the Bible as confirming what he discovered when he went within.
Mhm, mhm.
So he didn't go to the Bible first.
Right, right.
He went within, and when he would get a message, then he would go to the Bible to confirm it.
Yeah,
To,
yeah. I know it's so awesome. There was a philosopher named Swedenborg who did that as well. He started having all these inner experiences, and then he went to the Bible and went, "Oh, okay." And then but it was a very similar process, many centuries separated, but a similar kind of process. And so, yeah, that's a great that would be great. We'll get into that. Thank you. Appreciate the offer. Um, so, anybody else before we draw to a close? Because we I talked a lot tonight. And but that's the foundation of the groups that existed at the time. And next week we'll get more into the Jesus movement and what it actually did and how it kind of navigated in these other groups and how might we do that. So, um, all righty. Ani, do we have any of that things in that? Because I had to shift everything around, as you know, with the computer. So, do we have anything I was supposed to announce tonight that I've neglected to do?
I don't think so. I'm looking at the calendar. Wait, I'm on the wrong month. Don't go by me. Yeah, a gathering at Kathy's.
Talk
Yes,
about chaos, right? Oh yeah.
I know it really was. We are at Kathy's on the 23rd, and I have a couple of spots open still. So
Oh,
if
good.
anybody's no, Rafi just came up to volunteer to take
He'll
one.
go. Yeah, he'd be happy to go, believe me.
Yes. So, but we have that would be the 23rd. So if a couple of people are interested in coming, let me know.
It's one of our potluck gatherings where we have a potluck and then a group discussion afterwards. It runs from 12 to 4. And that's always on a Saturday. So the 23rd, you said?
Yes, the 23rd.
Cool. All right. So get a whole email on me if you're interested and want to come to that because there's a couple spots. So that'd be great. Yeah. All right. Um, I don't think there's anything else that we need to announce, but anyway, thank you all for coming. Some of you have not been here for a while, so welcome back. Lovely to see you. And you're welcome anytime. And you really are welcome to participate. Not only welcome to participate by making comments or questions during the classes, but very welcome to email me with ideas or comments as well too. So this series actually was a result of a couple of those comments. Um, so if you have ideas of future series you'd like to see, or particular questions, or things you would like your particular experience or insights about any of this stuff you'd like to share with me, just not even in public, but in an email, that's great. I always like hearing that. So, all righty, I think that's it. Let's just take a moment of quiet, if we would, with me for a minute, and just come back into stillness within us again. And recognize that beyond all of the belief systems, ideologies, thoughts, ideas about God, life, everything, beyond all that, at the very core of us, and at a much more subtle and higher vibration, there's a great simplicity of being. And at the core of that being is this boundless love that gives birth to joy and peace. And where we feel finally at home. So let us continue to hold that place at the center of our attention and the center of our lives, no matter what else we may believe or what else we may be doing. Thank you for being with me tonight. I really appreciate it. May you have a blessed week, and may it be a blessing to someone else in your week. Good night. Goodbye for now.